Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another video game retrospective where around 15 years after the release of the second installment, one of my all-time favorite franchises, here I'll be talking about my thoughts on Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, a game that, like the first game, I do have a lot of nostalgia for, with this actually being the first Uncharted game that I ever finished, as I gave up on my initial playthroughs of the original game back in the day. And while my overall opinions of that original game have dropped over time, I do feel like in general this game ages a lot better than that game. Well, despite the fact that they are very similar on paper, in that they follow the exact same gameplay formula, I do feel like that ends up being a boon to this game, and the fact that this game ends up being a tried and true sequel, a game that keeps with the original identity of the franchise, but actually is able to improve on the original game's formula in numerous ways, having a grander narrative and grander set pieces, increasing the cinematic nature of the game, something that the overall franchise is renowned for, but also having a more balanced gameplay loop, where while it is still a third-person action-adventure game that mixes in platforming and shooting and puzzle sections, again, in the original game, I did feel like there was this massive slog of combat encounters throughout the majority of the experience without much variation there, while this game, for the most part, fixes those issues. Again, having a better balance of platforming and puzzle sections mixed in more frequently with the combat to make it an overall much more enjoyable experience. So this really ends up being a major highlight for the series as a whole. So again, this was a game that was very much renowned when it originally came out, being a very important game for the franchise, having won many Game of the Year awards, and a game that again pushed forward how cinematic games can be in the video game medium, becoming a system seller for the PS3, which was really struggling at this point in time. And I do think you can largely credit this game's success for the PS3's success towards the end of its lifespan, with Uncharted ending up being this massive franchise for PlayStation, largely backed by the success of this specific entry. But again, like most of my retrospectives, I'll be running through the campaign of this game from beginning to end, chapter by chapter, to where typically I would have some more general concepts to talk about at the beginning of the video, though I do feel like with this game in particular, with it being such a linear, focused narrative experience, I do think it's much easier to just run through the game chapter by chapter and talk about the other more gameplay-centric topics as we get to them. So let's start off with Chapter 1, where this game does have a pretty iconic opening here, starting in media res, which in itself already adds more complexity to the storytelling of this game, clearly showing a leap from the storytelling of Uncharted 1. And again, this ends up being a fantastic opening, having Nate awakening after having clearly been injured, finding himself inside of a train that he quickly finds out is dangling over a cliff, adding this inherent mystery of how this happened, and instant sense of danger and how is Nate going to get out of this, with luggage hitting his face and his chair breaking, with him jumping away from it just in time, and even then still falls and hardly survives by landing on the guardrail at the bottom of the train, which he ends up having to hang on to, instantly thrusting us into gameplay here, being this incredible set piece of us climbing up this dangling train, feeling like us playing a scene from Mission Impossible, with, again, there just being so much tension here as the train continues to slip as we get higher and higher, debris falling down as you climb, while also this being a really great tutorial to the climbing systems in this game, making this such a perfect way to start this game, with this incredible action set piece, followed by some more monotonous little bits of gameplay and serving as tutorials, though it all leads up to us finding a dagger in the middle of the snow that obviously becomes the MacGuffin of this game. Though throughout this entire section, we do periodically get flashbacks to the beginning of the story. This story does take place a couple years after the events of Uncharted 1, where we do see Nate at a bar meeting two of his associates, both new characters for this game that were both conveniently never mentioned in Uncharted 1, that being Harry Flynn and Chloe Fraser, with Harry Flynn obviously being one of this game's main antagonists, but obviously you start off with him being an ally here. And while he's not a character that's particularly deep, I mean, feeling like a greedier and cockier version of Nate, and essentially being the antithesis to him throughout this story, his utilization in the story here is at least more complex than what we saw from likes of Roman and Navarro or Eddie Raja, to where he probably comes out of this game being one of the more interesting villains in the franchise up to this point, for whatever that means. Oh, well, Chloe also ends up being introduced here, obviously a more major character for for the franchise as a whole, later starring in Lost Legacy and also having a minor role in Uncharted 3, though her role in this game is probably her most notable one, with her coming off as a more complex character than pretty much anyone we see in Uncharted 1, being this love interest for Nate, with her being an old fling of his, while also being directly opposed to Elena, being this more cynical figure who is self-interested and willing to throw Nate under the bus at points, putting him in sticky situations to where, while I do think you can look at her character as a pretty tropey one, seemingly being this femme fatale, with us even getting this scene of her seducing Nate and getting him to agree to betray Flynn down the road, which obviously makes it clear to us, the player, the status of their relationship, to where, again, I've always liked Chloe as a character here, to where despite there being this opportunity to show her as this really one-note figure that only cares about the money or herself, we do actually see her genuinely seeming to care for Nate at points, to where despite having this survivalist mentality, we do have her going out of her way to help Nate, like going behind Flynn's back after the betrayal, to where mixing that in with her also being perfectly portrayed by Claudia Black here, it does lead to her being one of my favorite characters in the franchise, with it largely being spurred by her portrayal here, despite the fact that obviously she gets a much more complex portrayal down the road in Lost Legacy. But through this, we obviously do get the setup of this game's venture, with it revolving around finding Marco Polo's lost fleet, which is a less personal journey for Nate here, with the last game obviously doing a lot to parallel Nate and Francis Drake, to where with this game we really don't get this personal connection between Nate and Marco Polo, to where while I do think you can definitely consider that a major knock for the story here, I do think the intrigue between the characters themselves and how well they're portrayed ends up being enough to propel the plot forward here in a satisfying way, despite Nate's overall journey in this game not being as rewarding by the end to me. But following all these scenes from the train wreck, we do end up finally reaching chapter 2, where from this point on, we do continue on from where the flashbacks left us off, seeing Nate working alongside Flynn to sneak through an Istanbul museum to steal an oil lamp that's expected to lead to Marco Polo's treasure, which ends up giving us a tutorial to the stealth system that was added for this game, in which Nate will crouch before being detected by enemies, allowing you to do stealth takedowns, which can help narrow down enemies before getting into a full-out gunfight, though realistically it's not that major of a shakeup to the overall formula, where most of the times you just get into a gunfight anyway. But also this does give you a basic tutorial to combat, along with getting more parkouring sections, to where while this section can go on a bit long, it does have varying gameplay types to avoid it being dull, and again through it you also end up spending time with Flynn as your companion, allowing you to further connect to Flynn, playing alongside him in gameplay, which through that leads to his later betrayal feeling more personal to the players, something I feel is more impactful within the video game medium, though obviously we do see him acquire a lamp to find a map inside leading to Borneo, with mentions of the mythical city of Shambhala, obviously this game's final destination, though along with that mentions a curse, which is clear foreshadowing there, though obviously following this Flynn does betray Nate, showing him getting one up on Nate, which he does do numerous times in this story, to where despite the fact that he does come off as a bit of a failure throughout this game's run, he does actually outmaneuver Nate numerous times over the course of this game. But in this spot we do get an escape sequence, which there are many of in this game, and I do find a lot of them kind of annoying to play, where there's a lot of times that I just don't know where I'm supposed to be going, and even then the parkour system's still a bit too floaty to make sections like this go smoothly. But by the end of the sequence you just end up getting arrested anyway, which makes all this kind of dumb. But either way, after this we cut to 3 months later with Nate still being in prison, only for us to see Sully breaking him out, who ends up barely being in this game. So while it was cool to see obviously a reoccurring character at this point, something that we didn't see through the first 2 chapters, which I believe was intentional as a way to add appeal to new players of the franchise. Again, I do think having Sully back in the game here at this point does finally make you feel like this is a true sequel to the original game, despite the fact that he's barely here, which is kind of underwhelming in the fact that obviously he played such a major role in Uncharted 1, and while they obviously try to make up for that by making him such an integral character in Uncharted 3, his role here does feel very much watered down, to where while we do spend time with him in the following few chapters, and the content that we do get there is pretty strong, it does still feel like there was some untapped potential with having him a bit more in this game, to where it feels like he was kind of written out here to more so focus on this Chloe-Elena love triangle, which wasn't necessarily uninteresting, but but I do think there could have been a way to fit Sully into the story, especially once we eventually get to Tibet in particular. But anyway, it's also here where we do see Chloe being there to rescue him as well, with Nate being upset that she's there, thinking that she screwed him over, only for her to claim that she didn't, to where we just go back to working with her here, though obviously having some reservations, not knowing her true allegiances, which again I think perfectly fits in with the title of this game, Among Thieves, and to which do that I think they intentionally make it so that you are unsure if you can trust Chloe at many points in this game. But here we do hear about what Flynn is currently doing, working alongside his client in Lazarevic, a Serbian war criminal who ends up being the main antagonist of this game, bringing a similar dynamic to Roman and Navarro from last game, though thankfully much better than that. But this does take us to Chapter 3, taking place in Borneo, where we work alongside Sully to set up explosives that will serve as a distraction, allowing us to sneak into Lazarevic's camp to look at his files, with us getting another radically different locale from the previous 2 chapters, with that being an aspect of this game that does feel like it really expanded upon the previous entry, where that game in particular didn't have the most varied locations. Most of that game takes place on the same island, and to be fair, I mean, this section in particular does feel very reminiscent to that. Again, it is a section where we're going through a jungle alongside Sully. But again, already in this game, we already had a snowy area. We had a more modern looking museum. We also later end up going to a more modern city in Nepal. We end up going to a Tibetan village. So where, again, this game does have so many different types of locales, all of which, again, increasing the scale of this journey that we go on. But again, both chapters 3 and 4 take place in Borneo. Once again, being kind of a tutorial section to the game, being our first proper introduction to combat, and also being our first introduction to Lazarevic, with him instantly coming off as this menacing villain, generically killing his own henchman who tried to steal from him, where, despite the fact that he does come off as a very one-note villain across this game, he is by far the most intimidating Uncharted villain, and while it can come off as a bit over the top at points, I do still find Lazarevic to be one of the better villains in the series' run. But through eventually searching his camp, it's up to us just finding out information that we kind of already knew. Again, the fact that he's looking for Shambhala and wants to get the Cinnamoni Stone, but eventually we do regroup with Chloe to search through the tomb of Marco Polo's crew, where we do find the dagger from the opening section of the game, and it being this passport to Shambhala, which is still conveniently here somehow. But this is also where we do learn about our next location, that being a temple somewhere in Nepal. But as we leave, Chloe ends up returning alongside Flynn, once again making her motivations unknown, only for her to help us escape, while also trying to maintain her cover, allowing us to meet her in Nepal, all leading to Nate and Sully jumping off a cliff to escape, during which Sully says that he's getting too old for this, and that he knows when to walk away from the table, despite that not being the case in Uncharted 3. Which, I mean, to be fair, is more of an issue of Uncharted 3, which again, I'll talk about when I do a retrospective of that video, which I'll have a lot to say on this topic. But through that, it does lead to Sully, again, being out of the picture for pretty much the rest of the game, taking us to Chapter 5, where Nate arrives in Nepal, essentially being the true start to this game, where again, everything before this kind of felt like this tutorial and like blatant setup to the story, where now it feels like we're actually getting into what becomes the bulk of this game, with this section of the game feeling entirely unique from anything we saw in Uncharted 1, giving us our first urban environment in the series, but one that does largely feel alive here, and the fact that we do have a bevy of Lazarevic's men crawling around, or we do see Lazarevic's men taking over the city, and resistance fighters fighting against them at points, also instantly thrusting us into another action set piece, with a random truck chasing Nate, causing him to crash, to where we proceed to have to run away from it while we shoot at it at the same time, eventually causing it to explode. Again, another moment here that very much mirrors that of an action film, but with that we do proceed to get a series of combat encounters with some parkour sections in between, with again, these parkour sections feeling a bit unique, with us jumping from building to building and climbing up signs, which again, we've never seen before in this series. Though some of these encounters can be a little bit annoying, with many of this game's enemies obviously being heavily armored, where there are many points where enemies just feel like damage sponges in this game, and this is also where we get introduction to enemies with shields, which can also be annoying to deal with. But eventually we do get rescued by Chloe, who ends up destroying an enemy truck with an RPG, which is a pretty badass moment. We already spend the next couple chapters with Chloe as our main companion, as we head towards the temple alluded to earlier, to where we do spend chapter 6 climbing up a hotel, the tallest building in the city, to get a vantage point to find the temple, where along the way we do get a few more combat encounters, though again interspliced with some parkour sections, where I do really like how the balancing of the combat and the parkour sections are in this game, with them being seamlessly blended into each other at points, which ends up being a strong suit of this game's design. But the hotel ends up being another pretty strong set piece of us having to parkour around the outside and eventually reaching the top, where we can jump into the pool to get a Marco Polo joke, but obviously we end up seeing the temple from afar, which conveniently ends up being in the middle of all the gunfire and explosions, and ends up being where Lazarevich is camped, which who would have guessed that? But this is followed by another really massive action set piece here of us being chased down by a helicopter and us facing off against enemies as the helicopter's destroying the building we're in, with it crumbling mid-combat and eventually having to shoot the helicopter down with a grenade launcher, which all this is a really insane section. Probably ends up being the single most impressive set piece from a technical standpoint in this game. So again, just the notion of having the player inside of a building as it's collapsing mid-gameplay is a scenario that felt really unprecedented for the time. But eventually we do reach chapter 7. That starts with Nate and Chloe conveniently running into Elena, aka last year's model, with her conveniently doing a piece on Lazarevich, which again just feels super contrived. But she ends up being here alongside her cameraman, Jeff, who is a pretty useless character to a memeable degree, seemingly only added in here to add tension to Nate and Elena's relationship, with him being jealous of Jeff initially. But again, he ends up being a pretty bland character here. But again, cool to see Elena re-enter the picture here. So again, it adds to the notion of this being a true sequel. Though with the introduction of Chloe, I do think on a first appearance, you would worry if Elena was necessary for this game, with obviously Chloe already being a love interest. And while again, the love triangle between Nate and Chloe and Elena is something that is a bit generic, I do think this game effectively is able to use Chloe as a way to propel Nate and Elena's relationship, and showing how like-minded they are, and how much she ends up rubbing off on him, with them both being idealistic in nature, in comparison to Chloe, who has this more cynical nature that's typical of being a thief, to where, again, seeing this duality within him, of him wanting to be this more heroic figure, despite working around and being a thief himself, ends up being a major aspect of his arc through this game, and we instantly showcase this dynamic. Having Chloe being upset at Nate for wanting to bring Elena and Jeff with them, again, her criticizing him for wanting to be the hero, which is a theme constantly mentioned throughout this game. But also, it's clear that Chloe is obviously jealous of Nate and Elena's relationship. It's kind of funny considering she's only seen them interact for literally a few seconds here, but really this ends up being a pretty short chapter, comprised of a couple shorter encounters, and a weird puzzle of us having to use explosives to move cars to create a pathway across a river. But eventually it does take us to chapter 8, where we arrive at the temple, with strangely chapters 8, 9, and 10 all taking place within this temple, which I should mention with that the weird structuring of the chapters in this game, where the original game and the later main entries of the game all comprise of 22 chapters, with this game comprising of 26. So obviously that does showcase the longer length of this game. I do think there are many chapters of the game that just kind of feel a bit arbitrary, where it very much feels like they could have been kind of merged together. So I think in an ideal world, we would have kept with that trope across all 4 games, though obviously this is only the second game, so that wasn't really a trope at this point. Before these chapters, they have us being separated from Elena and Jeff because of Chloe's annoyances with them, weirdly leaving them at the entrance of the temple, which I'm sure won't put them in any danger. But it does lead to a pretty notable puzzle to me of us having to move the statue's limbs to match the picture in Drake's journal. But again, this mixing 2 aspects of the game at once, having this be a puzzle, but it requiring parkour, where again, it feels like it's balancing out this game's gameplay types. But reaching the following room starts chapter 9, and it taking place in a massive room for this pretty expansive platforming section that is also minorly a puzzle, and you having to find a way to move these mirrors to activate a mechanism to lower 3 blades that we have to climb one at a time to lower the other one, with all this being a pretty notable section to me, one of my favorite platforming sections in the game, though it does culminate in us finding out that Shambhala is in the Himalayas, giving us our next location. But just as we do, obviously we get ambushed, starting chapter 10, which is again another really short one, of us backtracking while fighting enemies along the way, eventually catching up with Elena and Jeff outside of the temple, to where shockingly Jeff is critically injured and can barely stand. For despite Chloe's chagrin, we do end up spending chapter 11 carrying Jeff through the streets as we continue to fight off enemies, which is a kind of annoying section here, as again, you're still in combat, though obviously you're mobility is very much limited, though obviously that adds to the cinematic nature of this section. But despite all this, it ends up being for naught anyway, as Flynn and Lazarevich catch up to you anyway, with Chloe again trying to get Nate to leave Jeff behind, only for him and Elena to refuse here, leading to her doing her thing and once again protecting her cover, to which she's just taken away, with Flynn telling them to take her to the train, which always felt like a weird scene. But here we do get our first face-off with Lazarevich, with again him coming off extremely menacing here, calling Drake a little man, and proceeds to kill Jeff for some reason, to which at that point you question, why not kill Elena, as she's also right there? Why kill Jeff, who's already dying anyway? And also, why not kill Nate himself? That would have ended his entire conflict in this instance. But here Lazarevich ends up taking his map and ends up not killing him himself for some reason, and instead telling Flynn to do it as he walks away, to which, what do you know, we're able to escape. But again, this entire scene feeling so contrived, and it feeling a bit ridiculous that Nate and Elena got out of this. But again, this is another pretty expansive escape sequence, where again, also very convenient that we survive this considering how many enemies are shooting at us. But eventually we do get to chapter 12, which has us trying to find this train that Chloe is getting on, with Elena fully supporting Nate in trying to rescue her, and ending up resisting his attempts to stop her from helping him, to where along with us also seeing her finish Nate's sentences when he's detailing his plan. Again, I do think this is a sequence that really does show you why the Nate and Elena relationship always felt more right for Nate here. Where again, Chloe has this more self-interested nature that doesn't really fit in line with the more developed Nate that we're getting in this game, where we really do see Nate and Elena being more in sync, with this chapter probably being the one narratively to really showcase the strengths in their relationship. But through it, we do get a couple notable combat sections, with us having to fight off enemies while holding on to a street sign, and also the final section of the chapter where we crash a train car towards the train tracks, where we have to fight a bevy of heavily armored enemies, and enemies with really strong weapons, leading to Elena coming to the rescue in a stolen Jeep, to where we end up driving close enough for us to be able to jump onto the train. With that, it does take us to chapter 13, which probably ends up being the most notable set piece of this game, in that the next two chapters take place on a moving train, which again felt like this massive technical feat at the time, and also one that again is clearly being the setup to the events of the opening section of the game, where you do spend a lot of this sequence of the game very much wondering, how does everything go wrong here? But again, we end up pushing forward while facing off a bevy of enemies, while also having to climb along the side and have to avoid upcoming signs, and later also avoid a helicopter, barely surviving our interaction with it, with the train conveniently entering a tunnel at the perfect timing, beginning chapter 14, which plays similarly to the last chapter, but eventually reaching a more snowy aesthetic, which again makes it clear that the prologue is near. But this section ends up having us face off against another helicopter that we take down with a machine gun, and then a mini boss battle against Lieutenant Draza, who ends up having the dagger on him for some reason, which again, like, why didn't Lazarevich keep it? But I always found the fight against him very strange, as again, initially you're going to genuinely try to fight him, in which he has powerful weapons and throws numerous grenades, to where shooting at him seemingly does no damage, to where all that feels ridiculous until you realize that the game intends for you to fist fight him, to where in doing so he dies almost instantly, which is funny that Nate's fist can take him down but bullets can't. But also conveniently, Chloe ends up saving us from Draza as he catches Nate off guard following this, only for Chloe to not want his help, still upset at Nate for picking Elena over her, despite him going so far out of his way to rescue her here. But as they argue, Flynn arrives, shooting Nate in the abdomen, exactly where he was injured in the prologue. Who would have guessed that? So we're obviously fully caught up to it here, with Nate making his escape by shooting a propane tank that's conveniently placed in front of him, leading to the train falling over a cliffside, and what do you know, we're back to the prologue. Obviously being this low point for Nate across this story, with him clearly being injured and still being in a bevy of danger, with also Lazarevich heading straight towards Shambhala, with also his status with Chloe being unknown and him being in the middle of nowhere. Again, this is obviously the low point for Nate's hero journey across this game, which did make it such an interesting point to start this game at. It's also a little bit weird from a structuring standpoint, where I think you would assume that this would be towards the end of the game, again, at least the end of like the second act of the game. But in reality, this is like barely past the halfway point, to where I remembered always being really shocked at how much game there is following this. But again, it does lead to chapter 15, which does start off similarly to the beginning of the game. us having to climb back up again, though they do make some changes here, so much for the better, not us obviously not having to do the entire climb, again, as that would have been repetitive, to where, again, some sections are made automatic, and we do get some different camera angles. Though something I don't like is that we also get some dialogue changes, which to me just feels like a bit cheap here, where now we get Nate directly referring to a specific situation, which, again, I would have liked it more if we had the same dialogue both times, but this time we have the context behind it to understand it more. But following the climb, we also do skip immediately to Nate finding the dagger, which, again, streamlines this entire section, though following we do get another gunfight, which is cool aesthetically, and the fact that it's taking place in the middle of the wreckage, also in the middle of a snowstorm, though I do find it funny how we kill all of them just to pass out following this, as how did Nate go this entire time without passing out and just conveniently does so after he kills all the enemies? But obviously he ends up being found by a local man, as he does, taking us to chapter 16, where Nate awakens in a Tibetan village under the care of Tenzin, the man who rescued him, who only speaks in Tibetan, though despite never being able to properly communicate with Nate or us the player, by the end of our time together, I do feel like you become pretty connected to Tenzin through how much gameplay you play alongside him, which again, plays into the strengths of the video game medium. But following this, we do get a short stroll through the village, which is a nice bit of downtime after pretty much non-stop action over the last few chapters, but also getting us connected to this village, which we obviously sadly see getting destroyed in the upcoming chapters, with the blame of that laying on Nate's shoulders, though eventually we do end up meeting back up with Elena, who had followed our trail, alongside with meeting Carl Schaefer, a German man that lives in the village, who also conveniently speaks English, to have someone that we can actually communicate with, to where Schaefer ends up being a bit of a strange character in this game, to where I do find his role here to be a bit underdeveloped. I do feel like he's a character that, while, again, I get that he's this figure that's meant to propel Nate to become this hero, I do feel like the fact that he is just sprung into the story simply for that, and is literally only in 2 scenes of this game, makes him feel like such an afterthought. That does make moments with him a bit melodramatic, but also makes his overall role in the story feel a bit lazy. But here Schaefer ends up revealing that he too was looking for Shambhala, and warns Nate of the power that the Sintamani Stone has, and what it would be like in Lazarevich's hands, only for Nate to tell him that he's done, feeling defeated, a typical trope of the hero's journey, only for him to convince Nate to go with Tenzin to see the remains of his crew, to show him the damage it would cause, where, why is Nate actually doing this? For Schaefer, a character that he literally just met. But either way, it takes us to chapters 17 and 18, which comprise of us traveling through a series of snowy caves alongside Tenzin, leading to a bevy of platforming sections with Tenzin, with him helping boost us up and setting up ropes, to where it does really increase your bond with him, with supposing this section being one of the inspirations behind The Last of Us, and them wanting to have an entire game focused around 2 characters from opposing worlds, where obviously that's a very clear indicator of how highly Naughty Dogs themselves look at this section of the game, though along the way we do end up finding some dead crew members, and we get some ominous shots along the way, setting up this impending danger, to which we eventually encounter that, the reveal of there being Yeti monsters, which I remember when I first played this game, I thought this was ridiculous, that they took a somewhat grounded story and added these Yetis to it. Again, having since then played Uncharted 1, these more supernatural aspects of the story have always been part of Uncharted, until they're not, which was obviously always a critique of mine of Uncharted 4. And I mean, to be fair, these Yetis aren't exactly what they seem to be, though even what they do seem to be still has supernatural aspects to it anyway. But here we do get our first encounter against one of them, to where, again, these are pretty brutal enemies to fight against, them taking so many hits and them being able to move very quickly and do a lot of damage. Where also through our first encounters with them, we are given very rudimentary weapons here that I remember really struggling with these fights on my initial playthrough, but both times we do fight them through these sections, they end up escaping without us fully taking one down. But chapter 18 does have us reaching a temple within the cave that leads to more platforming sections through many of the temple's contraptions, with these being some of my favorite parkour sections in the game, though eventually we do reach the inner chamber where we do find the remainders of Schaefer's crew, finding out that they were Nazis. Which I find it funny how this is like a little detail that's seemingly randomly thrown into the story here. Though also through that we get the reveal that Schaefer was the one to kill his own crew, which, again, Nate never really questions if Schaefer was in the wrong for this, though I guess the fact that he killed Nazis makes Schaefer look like the good guy anyway, even though he himself was one. But obviously you do figure it out that he was doing so to stop them from using the Sintamani Stone, which at this point you can assume ends up transforming people into monsters of some sort, which, again, I assumed at this point in the game that that's where the Yetis came from, though obviously it doesn't end up being exactly the case. But this does lead to another combat encounter with the Yetis, being a much more difficult one where there are multiple attacking you at once, though really it's one where you're essentially just waiting for the platform to arrive, which through it does lead to this cinematic moment of a Yeti jumping on the platform to where you have to shoot it down. But through this we do end up reaching the top of the mountain, where from there we do end up seeing the village under attack by Lazarevich, taking us to chapter 19, where we do fight alongside Tenzen protecting the village, which I will say starts a section of the game that I'm not the biggest fan of. It does feel like from this point on, the game does regress into being a bit of a slog of combat encounters, again, feeling like it's going back to the combat-focused gameplay that Uncharted 1 was based around, where while I can definitely appreciate certain sections of this portion of the game and how cinematic they are and the technical feats that they are, with again us getting some pretty big set pieces moving forward, I do find a lot of the following chapters pretty tedious to play. Though again, the next two chapters of this game end up being revolved around their respective set pieces, with chapter 20 having us being followed by a tank, which ends up being really annoying to deal with, where just being exposed for a few seconds leads to you dying instantly, which again can be an even further pain when you have other enemies surrounding you and shooting at you, though again it does add to the cinematic nature of the game. Though we do spend the entire chapter looking for an RPG that we eventually are able to destroy the tank with, which again, the section as a whole I do feel like takes a bit too long, but it does take us to chapter 21, which ends up being another grand set piece and us following Lazarevich's convoy with Elena as they have taken Schaefer along with the dagger, which has us jumping from truck to truck, taking out enemies along the way, ending in us taking out a bulk of the convoy, now very tropey style of encounter for the Uncharted series that's pretty much been used in every entry following this, though again at the time this was a very impressive set piece, feeling like another example of how this entry moved the series forward. But following that, we get back to the more standard gameplay loop with chapter 22, which takes us back to having the more typical enemy encounters, with again this section just feeling very derivative. While there are short platforming sections in the middle of all these encounters, the combat by this point in the game does end up feeling pretty repetitive, especially with some of these encounters being particularly difficult, especially one where they're having to climb a tower, to find a sniper rifle to take out a wide range of snipers in the towers surrounding you, along with there also being a bevy of enemies trying to cross over to your location through a bridge, to where I remember really struggling with this fight when I was younger, where obviously just from this point on, many of this game's enemy encounters end up having a bevy of snipers or enemies with RPGs, or have these like big, heavily armored enemies with machine guns, where again, it could just be pretty annoying to play. Again, feeling like a similar jump in difficulty of the encounters that we also had in Uncharted 1. And chapter 23 ends up functioning in a similar way, though it does lead to us finally finding Schaefer, who is mortally wounded, conveniently. Where again, this ends up being a really melodramatic scene of him inspiring Drake to destroy the Sintamani Stone, which again just felt entirely overdramatic, especially for a character like Schaefer, a guy who we literally only had one conversation with before this. To where again, very clearly this scene did not have the impact the writers thought it would, but again, it does propel Nate's character forward. Though, following this, we obviously get more combat, with again, more tedious fights here. But eventually we do catch up with Lazarevich, who is scolding Flynn for being a failure, all while Chloe is given the dagger to hold for some reason. Again, very convenient, as obviously Nate ends up confronting her, only for her to just give up the dagger and leave. Which again, I do find it strange how she doesn't even stay around to help Drake, which I guess adds to the dichotomy between her and Elena, but still felt weird as like, where's she going? But here we do get a puzzle that I've always personally found very tedious, and you having to align 4 mythical beasts with their respective shapes through coordinating their colors in Drake's journal, and then slowly lugging around these pieces to the right location, and also have to memorize a symbol for each one as well, with again, it just not being a particularly fun puzzle to play. And what do you know, this leads to another tedious combat section as we reunite with Elena. But it does finally lead to us unlocking the entrance to Shambhala, taking us to chapter 24, where we conveniently get caught by Lazarevich. But again, him coming off very intimidating here and killing another of his own men for some reason, along with him also revealing that Chloe got captured, because obviously, here we have him keeping Drake alive, thinking that he needs him to open the way, with him not trusting Flynn to do so anymore, leading to us working alongside Flynn to do so, allowing for some pretty fun dialogue here between the two. This being, again, a humorous contrast to chapter 2, with Nate and Flynn obviously ending up mocking each other along the way, and Flynn pushing Nate around throughout the majority of this section, with Flynn clearly having resentment towards Drake. There being jealousy stemming from Nate's relationship with Chloe, but also through how Drake at this point is essentially just the better version of him, where Lazarevich is literally keeping him around simply because he doesn't trust Flynn to be able to do this on his own. But finally, this video get another puzzle section of memorizing symbols that we have to replicate, but is followed by us getting another fight against the Yetis, as the gate ends up opening, which can be a pretty difficult encounter here, though largely feels in line with the previous one at the temple, but also feeling very reminiscent to the fight alongside Eddie Raja in Uncharted 1, though, again, it's another one where we're essentially just waiting for the section to end, with Lazarevich again ends up showing how strong he is, with him easily being able to kill these Yetis, exposing them for what they really are, which is a human in a suit. These humans being the guardians of Shambhala, these people that have used the Sintamani stone, in essence showing their supernatural abilities, that I guess can be defeated by a Serbian war criminal, though again, just increasing the threat that Lazarevich poses. Though following this, we do see this typical fatal flaw from him that we get from many overly generic villains, and him getting overconfident and deciding to not kill Nate in this situation, waiting for him to finally see Shambhala so he can die knowing that he had taken it from him. Taking us to chapter 25, where we enter Shambhala, which I will say does look very cool aesthetically, looking really expansive and majestic. It ends up being this locale that I wish we spent a little bit more time in, though also I will mention the logistics of this feel a bit ridiculous, and how is the city not found from overhead, considering how massive it is. But again, now that we finally have seen Shambhala, Lazarevich finally decides to kill Drake, only for Flynn to interrupt him, wanting to save Chloe for himself, to which, by the time that wraps up, the Guardians end up conveniently attacking, allowing us to escape, to where following that, despite Chloe wanting to leave, because that's Chloe for you, we see Nate and Elena end up wanting to stop Lazarevich and save the world, which Chloe laughs at, being her typical cynical self, though Nate and Elena again end up convincing her to go alongside them. Following this, we do get some of the more difficult enemy encounters in the game, to where they end up mostly involving the Guardians, who end up being a big pain to kill, though funnily, if you do have a crossbow, which is the weapon that they end up utilizing, it actually ends up being a really overpowered weapon in this game, being a one-hit kill on them, which is pretty insane, considering how every other weapon takes forever to kill them. While navigating through these areas, we do see a lot of blue sap along the way, which ends up being explosive, allowing for us to open up new paths. Eventually we do reach the Sintamani stone, realizing what it actually is, that being a gigantic ember of blue resin coming from the Tree of Life, where drinking it will give you near invincibility, which again adds to the more supernatural aspects of the story, though also I do find it very strange how we see so many people dying after having drunk this thing that's supposedly going to lead to immortality. But either way, after finding this out, we do get our final interaction with Harry Flynn, who's clearly on his final leg. During this spot, I do think you very much would have expected him to have this redemption arc on his way out, with Elena even offering to help him, playing into her idealistic nature, but instead he decides to blow himself up, seriously injuring Elena in the process, which is a weird way for him to go here, though again, at least didn't fit into the typical tropes that you would have expected it to. But this does lead to our final normal enemy encounter, clearing the way as Chloe ends up carrying Elena behind us, which I actually do like this section here, and essentially giving us a whole bunch of overpowered weapons all in a row, allowing us to easily take out the enemies in front of us, though following this we do end up leaving Elena in Chloe's care, despite Chloe's chagrin, going off to take down Lazarevich, taking us to the final chapter of the game, chapter 26, which is pretty much entirely comprised of the final boss battle against Lazarevich, to where we do end up fighting him immediately after he ends up drinking the tree sap, allowing for him to be nearly indestructible, though the way to damage him here is to shoot the nearby sap, causing an explosion that will injure him, and we have to do this numerous times, with it getting more and more difficult every single hit, with him starting to throw grenades, or shoot the sap himself, or eventually having the ground crumble beneath us. But overall, I do really like this final boss battle, with it feeling like an actual proper final boss, which again should not be much to ask for, but somehow we don't get proper boss battles at the end of Uncharted's 1 and 3, which, I mean, I do think is pretty fitting considering how much more intimidating of a villain Lazarevich is, unlike Navarro or Talbot. So taking them down never felt particularly satisfying. So while, again, Lazarevich is an antagonist that does come off very one-note, he did very much feel like this genuine threat, and having to take him out in a way that does feel very unique, that isn't just shooting him a billion times or fist fighting him, just felt right in this spot. So while not the most complex fight in the world, I do find this final boss here very satisfying, though I do also find it funny how Drake isn't the one to end up killing Lazarevich by the end, leaving him for the Guardians to end up killing him instead. Again, immediately after, Lazarevich calls him out for having killed so many men along the way. So again, this ends up being this moment here that's supposed to wrap up Nate's arc across this game, of him trying to be this hero amongst thieves, though I do feel like that development comes off very strange to me, as, again, despite, again, this game trying to show him in a more heroic light. Again, it feels like Uncharted 1 had him more as this like anti-hero, while I feel like this game just tries to transition him to just an outright hero, setting him apart from the other thieves, though, again, feeling very disparate from the gameplay of this game. Again, adding this bit of ludonarrative dissonance, considering just how many people Drake kills in this game. But again, I always felt like Nate's arc across this game always came off as a bit comical to me, but again, after leaving Lazarevich, it does take us to our final gameplay section, us having to escape Shambhala, running alongside a bridge as it crumbles around us, and us getting our final bit of gameplay and us rescuing Chloe from a Guardian. Again, being the type of set piece you would expect to wrap this game up, a game that, again, is so reliant on its impressive set pieces. After escaping, we do get this fake out here and us thinking that Elena is dead, only for us to cut to a bit later in time where we see him mourning over a grave, implying that it was Elena that died here, only for us to end up talking to Chloe, who ends up asking him if he loves Elena, only for him to not deny that, leading to them parting on good terms, but also revealing that Elena is alive, which, again, she better be, as that would have been a very lackluster way to write her out of the story. But it's also here where we get a short cameo from Sully, who ends up showing up here for no reason. We're in the game here with Nate and Elena paying respects to Schaefer because he was obviously such an integral character, and talk about how he would have been proud of Nate because I guess we're supposed to care so much about Schaefer. Though we end the game with them kissing and joking around about how scared he was that she was gonna die, which again, it's a very nice way to end this game, to where, again, it becomes very clear that Nate and Elena are gonna try to be in a relationship following this, which, to be fair, is not that big of a difference between how Uncharted 1 finished, to where, while this game does solidify the relationship even more, I do find it funny how this game technically ends their relationship in a similar spot to where Uncharted 1 ended, portraying their relationship status in a similar light at the end. But with that, again, that is the entirety of Uncharted 2, which, again, is a game that, despite having some nitpicks with the game, particularly certain gameplay sections that are a bit tedious, or certain aspects of its narrative that feel a bit underdeveloped, I do think as a whole, Uncharted 2 is a massive step up from Uncharted 1, and following the same formula as the previous game, though improving upon it in every single aspect. So again, I don't think there's a single thing from Uncharted 1 that isn't done better in Uncharted 2 outside maybe just narrative focus, yet even then, I do still come out of Uncharted 2 with more respect for its storytelling than that of Uncharted 1, so where, again, it ends up having a grander narrative, a more satisfying balance of different gameplay types, while also having some of the most impressive set pieces in any game up to this point. So again, this game very much broke ground for the time. Again, being declared as Game of the Year for 2019 by many, and I do think that is a distinction that largely holds to this day. So again, this is still a great game, to where despite my nitpicks with it, I do think this is a game that fully realizes the initial premise of Uncharted, and in being was essentially a video game version of a summer blockbuster, to where, while I do think you could still debate over which Uncharted game is the best, to where, again, I still lean towards my personal favorite being Uncharted 4, I do think at the end of the day, that's a game that does strip away from the initial premise of Uncharted a bit, to where, and I do think if I'm going by what the series was initially meant to be, I do think Uncharted 2 fully keeps that identity intact, to where I think there's a serious argument for this being the best game in the franchise, despite there definitely being some holes to pick here and there. But with that, those are my thoughts on Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, and with that, I've now done a retrospective on every main entry in the series outside of Uncharted 3, which again, I'll probably do on its respective anniversary 2 years from now. And beyond that, obviously, I have other game retrospectives coming out before the end of the year. I have like my Assassin's Creed Rogue and Unity retrospectives. I have a Tales from Borderlands retrospective. And again, I'll probably have other video game videos sprinkled out over time, so stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.